Last Sunday I was talking about how, the person that I had in my church that fell asleep every Sunday. And somebody reminded me a story that I forgot about. They did a study one time, and they discovered that when you go into surgery while you're under anesthesia, if in the operating room the mood is upbeat and the surgeons and the people are laughing and having kind of a good time during your surgery, that you go through post-op quicker and better than if they're in a bad mood. So if you fall asleep during church today, and later this afternoon you get a twinge of something good feeling, if it worked in surgery, maybe it'll work in the sanctuary. We are looking at the Gospel of Mark, and there's some that were here Wednesday night, and we went over some things, and I was planning to go on to the next text, but this text is so important for understanding the big picture of what's going on here that I think we really need to land here for a few minutes. So we're going to talk about the cost of discipleship, what it means to be a follower of Jesus, and it's not easy. In chapter 6, beginning in verse 14, King Herod heard of it. Now, what did he hear? He heard about how successful Jesus had been. He'd been going around, and crowds were getting bigger and bigger, and he'd been so successful in many ways that Herod and everybody else was talking about it. And some said who Jesus was John the Baptist, who'd been raised from the dead, and that is why Jesus had those miraculous powers. Others said that it's Elijah, and others said that he is a prophet, like one of the old prophets. And so the three common guesses that people had for who Jesus was John the Baptist, who'd been risen from the dead, or Elijah, who was a prophet in the Old Testament that was supposed to be a predictor of the coming Messiah, or that it's one of the old prophets that have come back to life. And in verse 16, when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. Now, when you read this and you think of Herod, a lot of times people think of the Herod from the birth stories in Matthew. The story that Herod, murdered all the boy children 3 and under in Bethlehem. Now that's the different Herod, and it's understanding that you'd be confused because there were like 7 Herods in the Bible. Did you know that? 7 different Herods, and most of the time when it talks about them, it doesn't delineate which one it is as carefully as you might think. And so you read it and you think, oh, it's Herod. That's Herod. I know Herod. 7 different people. So I wanted to give you a little background about who these Herods were. The first Herod, we know him as Herod the Great, not because he was a great person or even a good person, but because he built all kinds of fabulous things. He rebuilt Jerusalem. He built the Temple Mount. He built this fortress on the top of a mountain I went on to once. It was beautiful, called Masada. He built the Herodian palaces in Jericho. He built temples to Augustus and Sebastus. And he built these huge projects, and people thought him as the great. It also, they remember, because he did kill the children in looking for the baby Jesus. He killed all the children in Bethlehem and in the surrounding region. Now, in the Catholic understanding, many Catholics believe that this was like 14,000 or more children, but that doesn't really jive with the facts we know. Bethlehem had a population of 300 when Jesus was born, and so if you calculated how many boy children in a town of 300 were below 3, it probably would have been about 4 or 5 young kids. And if you enlarge that to a territory a little bigger, it probably would be under 10 kids. Now, 1 child killed is devastating, is a huge crime. But it wasn't like thousands, and that's why you cannot find this in the history books. It's only in the Bible. It does not mean it didn't happen. It means that it was such a small event compared to the other terrible events that Herod the Great did, that it just didn't qualify for that. but this did happen. He tried to kill Jesus, but he wasn't able to. Herod, the first Herod, known as Herod the Great, had a large territory. I've got a map here of the territory that he was over. Galilee is in the north, and then in between Galilee and Judea was Samaria. All that is in the east, and on the west side they had the Decapolis area. That's in purple. That means 10 cities. And then Perea, which is another section. So all this section together, basically Herod conquered when he headed up 2 Roman legions that they lent him as he conquered the area of Israel. That was the first Herod. He died in 4 BC, which you might say, well, if he was alive when Jesus was born, how was it 4 BC? Because somebody got the calendar wrong. The calendar was not infallible scripture. Somebody got the calendar wrong. Jesus was actually born between 4 and 5 BC. Okay? And Herod died in 4 BC. After Herod died, he had 3 sons that came after him. He actually had more than that. He had 10 wives. Can you imagine that? Being married 10 times. I remember, well, I'm not going to tell that story, never mind. Elizabeth Taylor said once to her husband, "Don't worry, I won't keep you long." Maybe that is what Herod said to his wives. So, 3 of his children was Herod Archelaus. Now, that person is mentioned in the Bible only once. That's when Jesus, or Joseph and Mary come with Jesus back to the region of Bethlehem, and they're warned by God not to go to this area because Herod Archelaus, who was a bad guy, was the tetrarch of that area. And so they went instead to Nazareth, where Jesus grew up. Herod Antipas was the tetrarch of the area of Galilee and Perea, and Herod Philip was the far north on the west side. I've got a map here that shows how they're laid out. You can see that Philip is in the north. Antipas had 2 sections. Archelaus was in the south. Now the other person was Salome. Who was that? Well, that was Herod's sister, Herod the Great's sister. So they divided these areas that Herod had been the king of to 4 areas. They called them tetrarchs. Tetras means 4. And so areas of 4 in which there were leaders of it. And this is the areas after Jesus passed. Now, the other 2 Herods in the Bible is Herod Agrippa, who was the grandson of Herod the Great. Herod Agrippa is the one that in the book of Acts kills one of the sons of thunder, James, one of the apostles. He has him killed, and he tries to kill Peter and Silas, but they break out of the prison in the midnight and able to survive that experience. But that was Herod Agrippa. There's a story in the Bible when Herod Agrippa died, he was eaten by worms. Not a very nice story. But that was not the Herod the Great. Okay, this was his grandson. And Herod Agrippa is the last Herod mentioned in the Bible, and he was the one that Paul went to at the very end of his life to appeal to see if he wouldn't have to be killed, which he didn't survive it. But I have a list. This is all of them in the Bible. Herod the Great, Archelaus, Herod Antipas, Philip, Agrippa, and Agrippa the 2. You got that? Okay? I know it's confusing. Today, we're talking about Herod Antipas, who reigned from 4 BC to 39 AD, and that's what we're talking about. In verse 17, for it was Herod Antipas who had sent and seized John the Baptist and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because he married her. Okay, there's a map, shows where this prison was. It was in Perea. That's the deep green section at the bottom. Machaeus, it was a palace prison. And this was, the Machaeus means, or Macculus means sword in Greek. And so it's befitting that this is where John the Baptist was killed it was called the place of the sword. John had been saying to Herod, "It's not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. You shall not uncover the naked." This is a verse from the Leviticus. It was illegal for him to divorce his wife and marry his brother's wife. Why? In Leviticus 18:16 it says, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife. It is your brother's nakedness." And then in Leviticus 20:21, "If a man takes his brother's wife, it's impurity. He has covered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless." And so he did two things wrong. He divorced his wife and then married another woman just because he fell in love with her, Herodias. Now, this is where it becomes complicated. Okay. You ever heard of the Kardashians? They got nothing on the Herodians. Okay? And this map shows the complicatedness of it. He had 10 wives. Only 4 of them had children. Now, the first wife he had was Mariamne. She had 2 boys. Herod heard that these 2 boys were plotting to take over his reign. So he killed his first 2 sons and their mom. So that wife was gone. In fact, he killed 2 other children that were boys. There was a saying, it's better to be Herod's pig than Herod's son, because Jewish people wouldn't kill a pig because it was, pork, but he would kill sons. And it's a play on words, because pig in the Greek is a heis. It's called a heis, and a son is called a haius. So it's better than to be Herod's heis than his haius. I guess it's better in Greek if you. And so this whole, if you put the map back on, so Herod Antipas was married to this woman who was the daughter of a Nabatean king, which is part of the geography in the south of the Holy Land. And so the Romans liked that because they looked at Israel as kind of a borderland. And so Herod Antipas had married this daughter of this Nabatean king. But he was visiting his family, and he met his brother's wife, whose name was Philip. He fell in love with her, and so him and Herodias plotted on what they were going to do about it, because he was already married. And so they had this plan that they were going to have her assassinated, his current wife. This young princess found out about it. She runs back to her dad, the Nabatean king. The Nabatean king is so mad, he rouses his army and attacks Perea. And so Herod Antipas has to get a Roman legion to come down and settle it so that the whole land is not destroyed. But it is a mess. Basically, Herod just takes what he wants. So Herodias, who's now married, and Herodias was Herod Antipas's niece. Imagine that. He fell in love with his brother's wife, who's also his niece. Confusing. And they got married. And so Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to put him to death, because John the Baptist kept going around saying, y'all not supposed to be married. That's wrong. And Herodias wanted to kill him. But she could not, for Herod Antipas feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. And when he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he heard him gladly. Can you imagine this? Here is a conflict. He doesn't like what John the Baptist is saying, but there's something about this righteous man of God that is attractive. I think that's the way it happens today sometimes. I heard a story of a pastor in a large church in Florida many years ago, and in his church he had a PGA professional golfer. And one Sunday afternoon, this PGA professional said that there was a special golf match that they'd been able to put together, and would the pastor like to play with it in it. And it happened to be Jack Nicklaus, Billy Graham, this PGA professional, and the pastor. Sounds like a pretty good match. It's not a joke, by the way. It's true. And so they went out and played, and the PGA professional was not a Christian. But at the end of the golf match, he'd had, a bad golf match, and he left quickly, and he went to the golf range, and he was just hitting balls, and you could tell he was angry. And so the pastor came over to him and said, well, are you okay? And he said, not really. He said, well, what's going on? He said, I just don't think somebody ought to be preached to all the time. And then he said, really? Did that happen? I don't remember Billy Graham saying anything like that to you. And he didn't. But there was something about being in the presence of a righteous person that made him feel that way. Can you imagine? Even though Billy Graham did not say anything to him, judging him, just being in the presence of somebody like that, it both attracts you to them, but it also can make you afraid. And all the sin that this Herod had done, Herod Antipas, he was attracted to John the Baptist, but he was also afraid of him, and he protected him because of that. So, verse 21, an opportunity came when Herod on his birthday, by the way, Jews never celebrated birthdays. This shows you that Herod was only very, very part Jew. But the Romans loved to celebrate birthdays. Herod on his birthday gave a banquet for his nobles and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. So this banquet was all men. This was a guy's event. There was a lot of probably wine going on. There was a lot of, it was that kind of event. And Herodias' daughter came in and danced at this event. And this is Herodias' daughter. She's probably 15, 16 years old. And she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, ask me for whatever you wish, and I'll give it to you. What a terrible mom. I started to use this as a Mother's Day sermon. I need one coming up. But she's a bad example. Bad example. Here she gets her daughter to dance, and basically it's called the dance of the veils. It's like a strip show. It's like a striptease. She gets this daughter to dance in front of all these men when they've been drinking and having all this, and here her stepfather looks at her now, and I don't know, I don't want to get into it, but it's just a bad scene. And he says in his drunkenness, ask me for whatever you wish, I'll give it to you. And he vowed to her, whatever you ask, I'll give it to you up to half my kingdom. Well, this is a joke. Herod was a tetrarch. He did not own 1 acre of land. He managed the land for the Romans. In fact, the Romans never called him a king. He made the people that were in his control called him a king, but Rome never called him a king. He was a tetrarch, and he brags, I'll give you half my kingdom. And she went out and said to her mom, Herodias, for what should I ask? Now, her mom probably is thinking, well, I've already got everything because I'm the wife of the king. What else could I get? Because I already got whatever he's got. But she says to herself, I hate that John the Baptist. He keeps talking. That's what I want. And she says a gruesome thing. She told her daughter to ask for the head of John the Baptist. And she came in immediately, with haste, to the king, middle of the party, men of all of the guests, all the important military commanders. They just heard him give the vow, and she says, I can imagine her saying it this way. I want you to give me, and everybody's listening, at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Imagine the impact. It must have been a terrible thing for him to go through, to hear this kind of thing, what they wanted. And what happened? What happened? The king was exceedingly sorry because of his oaths. He had 2 oaths he gave. And his guest, he did not want to break his word to her because he didn't want to be dishonored in front of them. And so immediately the king sent the executioner with orders to bring John's head, John the Baptist. The one Jesus said there's no greater human being than John the Baptist. And he went and they beheaded him in the prison. And they brought his head on a plate that they served food on. And they gave it to the girl. And the girl gave it to her mother. What a terrible gift. And when the disciples heard of it, they came and took his body and they laid it in a tomb. It reminds us of stories in the Old Testament when Saul and his son Jonathan were beheaded, and Benaiah and others went and got the bodies and buried them. The disciples risked their lives to go and take care of him. It may have been disciples that once had been John the Baptist's disciples. And so this gruesome story. So what we can learn from it today? It's ironic that the King Herod the Great, was called the King of the Jews. That's what he became known as, because he was over the whole area of Israel, the King of the Jews. And Jesus was also called what? On the cross, they put a sign above his head, the King of the Jews. If you was to compare those two kings, Herod the king and Jesus the king, and think about how different these two are and how we need to be different. For instance, if you got Herod over here and Jesus over here, think of the difference between the two. Herod was into the external show. He wanted to look good in front of people. Jesus was externally humble. Most of the times when Jesus healed somebody, he'd say, now don't go and tell anybody. I don't want anybody to know. Jesus could have done it with a lot more flair. He didn't. He was a humble guy. And in our lives, we need to look at our lives and think we don't need to be about external, about who we're trying to impress. We need to be about doing the right thing just because it's the right thing. Herod was motivated by fear. He was afraid. He was afraid he'd lose his kingdom. He was afraid how people would look at him. He was afraid he wouldn't look strong. Jesus was motivated by faith. Jesus had great faith. It didn't matter, how bad things got. Jesus had great faith that sustained him. What about me and you? Do we often let fear overwhelm us? Do we get afraid about what's coming next and how we're going to get through it? This is what Herod did. He let fear dominate his life. And Jesus was a person of faith. In your life and my life, we need to be people of faith. We need to model it. We need to look to be that kind of people that can get through no matter what comes. And then Herod believed that might makes right. And he used power to overcome others. Jesus did the opposite. Jesus was weak when he was strong inside and in his character. He did not use that strength that he had to take over like he could have. When he was on the cross, he could have had legions of angels come to his side. He didn't have to go through any of that. Yet he chose to become weak so that he might take on our sins. And he showed great strength in doing that. And sometimes in your life and my life, even though we might have the right to stomp on somebody else, to prove them wrong, sometimes we ought to do the opposite. We ought to be strong inside and say, well, I don't have any need to prove anything. I have no need to make myself look better. Often we get this idea, well, they did this and they were in the wrong. That's Herod's approach. Instead of being motivated by external humility, not meaning that you should let people walk all over you, but you need to realize the big picture in life on what God wants you to be and how God wants you to live. The end of this story, the last verse in this section, if you remember, the section began, it was like a sandwich. It began with the 12 disciples being sent out. And then the story of John the Baptist beheaded. It's like a flashback. And then the story of them coming back. But notice, when they left, they were called disciples. What are they called when they come back? Apostles. Something had happened to them. They went from just being people who read and learn to being people who do. They went out 2 by 2, and they taught and they did all kinds of work. They also went out and got John's body. They did all kinds of things. And so there was a change that went on in their lives. But what this story tells us is that if you do all the right things for God, sometimes you might wound up. That's what happened to John the Baptist. He did everything right. So I can't promise you that if you're a follower of Christ, you're going to be rich, healthy, happy, and good looking. That's not the gospel. But the gospel says if you are a follower of Christ, no matter what you go through, you can overcome it through Jesus' strength. Today, we think about this name Herod. Have you ever met